This morning I had a revelation, and some ingredients that sort of sit in the back of my head all of a sudden came together. And I want to share that with you this morning. It has to do with the UN Global Compact on Migration and what I think is the real purpose of it. There were three things, three individual pieces that all gelled this morning. And the first has to do with something we talked about yesterday. So I just want to refresh everybody's memories as well as mine. It was this bureaucratic theory by Max Weber. Now, he talked about how bureaucratic organization is the premier organization to control human beings, and that essentially it is a legal framework. It's based on rules and policies and laws. And the key part that I didn't pay much attention to yesterday but want to point out now is this. All aspects of a democracy are organized on the basis of rules and laws, making the principle of established jurisdiction prevail. Making the principle of established jurisdiction prevail. In other words, you can't enforce laws or rules somewhere that you haven't established your right to do so. Jurisdiction, we know what that means. So my argument yesterday was that this is the way international and supranational organizations such as the UN and the EU are colonizing the rest of the world through bureaucratic legal frameworks, mostly treaties. And then from there springs forth all these mini bureaucracies and policy enforcement arms and also all the attendant things like NGOs, which are basically modern day lobbying groups, etc. So that was in my head. And then this morning I'm just looking at various news items, and actually someone from the Rebel Media, Ezra Levant, the owner of the Rebel Media, posted an excerpt from the Global Compact on Migration. He posted this highlighted paragraph. So I read this. The compact, anybody signs the compact is agreeing to these parameters and many more, but this is the one we're going to concentrate on. The focus here should be on what the nations are obligated to provide to the migrants. Legal guidance on their rights and access to justice to file complaints about rights violations, as well as on access to basic services. And the rights are laid out throughout the whole rest of this document. And there's lots of them. There's some right in this paragraph. Really vague things like targeted, gender-responsive, child-sensitive, accessible, and comprehensive information. All of those phrases are way open for interpretation. And the UN is asking countries to sign on to an agreement where we will be obliged to play by those rules. In other words, they're establishing jurisdiction, right? But here's where it really gelled for me. Watch this little, I've cut out a tiny piece of Marine Le Pen's press conference that she held yesterday.
Le 10 et le 11 décembre, M. Macron s'apprête à signer à Marrakech le Pacte mondial pour les migrations sûres, ordonnées et régulières. Avec cette nouvelle trahison silencieuse de la nation, nos dirigeants franchissent une nouvelle étape dans la submersion organisée de notre pays. Ces promoteurs, mus par une idéologie mondialiste assumée, se fixent pour vaine ambition de rendre les migrations bénéfiques à tous. Au même titre que le droit international reconnaît le statut protecteur aux 25 millions de réfugiés, les immigrationnistes entendent désormais offrir un statut aux 225 millions de migrants dont les parcours seront désormais promus, organisés et protégés par le droit international.
Just the way she said that made me realize something. Each migrant is basically a citizen of the United Nations now, because the United Nations is the entity that's granting these people their rights. In other words, put another way, each migrant, each individual migrant is a moving, portable jurisdiction. And who gave them that jurisdiction? Who owns that jurisdiction? The UN. Each migrant is basically like the UN flag being planted in our countries. So however many we take, that's however much jurisdiction the United Nations has. I don't think I'm far off. What I'm imagining in my head, first of all, is the concept of lawfare. Imagine how overwhelmed our systems are going to be when we have to provide access to legal services for any challenge of any of these vaguely worded rights that the United Nations is giving them, which are separate from the rights that the regular full citizens of those nations have. They're separate. They're completely different. Basically, these people are citizens of the United Nations and their idea of rights. And the United Nations, keep in mind, exists solely to churn its policies and bureaucracy. That's all it does. It doesn't have to provide health care for its citizens. It doesn't have to provide education or clean the roads or national defense or any of the things that government does in our nations are going to disadvantage us against the United Nations in any legal battle, because all the United Nations does all day, every day, is engage in legal battles. So they are sending these migrants all around the world into the democracies that they want to subvert. If you look at it, that's where they're targeting. So many resources are going to go towards providing legal services in all these various languages to all these various migrants and try to bend over backwards to their cultural traditions. We have to learn all the ways of these new citizens of the United Nations that are coming into our countries. International law is new.
These have been created over the years. Some of them date back to the 19th century, but for the most part, that's a kind of 20th century phenomenon. So one of the things we see in the last century or so has been, one, the rise of these international organizations, the UN being the paramount example, and two, the use of treaties. Treaties existed in the past, but when we talked about custom and common law, that was much more common. Now we tend to codify that in a treaty. So those two things are sort of two major trends of the last century.
It was in the last 100 years, and even the last half century for the most part, that this proliferation of treaties and supranational bodies has come into being. Really, international law was something that was settled between two countries by just cutting off trade with one another. Or sometimes some wars happened between two countries over violations. But how can the UN enforce anybody's rights from their perch far away based on some piece of paper that we all signed? How can they do that? The truth is that's a major stumbling block for their colonization. At any time, countries can just pull out of different treaties, or refuse to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the WTO or the Security Council or the International Criminal Court. And the US has done that. This is why they hate Donald Trump. He's pulling out of agreements and treaties and refusing to acquiesce to this jurisdiction of the supranational bodies all over the place. So they hate him for that. They hate all the populists for the same reason. They're doing that. They're saying, I don't want to be part of your agreement anymore. So the UN sees the facade, this magic spell that it had cast over us, where we all agreed and therefore, oh my God, there's nothing we can do. We made this agreement and we have to stick to it even if it hurts us. That magic spell is breaking. And so what they're trying to do is put literal pieces of their territory inside our territory, which will be much, much harder for us to refuse to deal with because there they are in front of us. In the end, what I think this is leading to is for all of us that sign on to this treaty and have these migrants in our countries, where we're bound by these rights that were given to them by the UN. I think the UN is going to make the claim that there's only one possible way to settle disputes about these rights, which is to go to a UN court, a human rights or migrant rights or citizen rights, world citizen rights court, something like that, something Orwellian like that. And it will only apply to people who aren't actually citizens of the countries in which they're making the claims. And by that mechanism, with the chaos it will cause, the resource draining that it will cause, the community breakdown that it will cause, I believe the UN is seeking to further entrench its attempt to colonize all of us via international treaties. I'm going to stop talking now. Thanks a lot for listening to this brand new idea that came into my head today. I apologize if it wasn't fully formed, but I hope you got something out of it. I hope this can give you a new frame with which to talk about this very important issue. Our democracies are being subverted, and it is planned and organized. We are not going to be able to deal with the chaos storm and the lawfare that results from this. We need to stay out of this pact. In fact, I'll talk about it in subsequent videos, but we really need to stay out of, we need to get out of treaties that we're already a part of before the UN and the EU do build a world army, and then there'll be no way of getting out peacefully. Okay, really stopping talking now. Zip. I'll talk to you soon. Thumbs up, subscribe, leave a comment. Peace out.